Hey, Paul here for Retro Gaming Arts, and I've been playing around on this hacked Vita, and it's amazing, and it's so awesome. And so this one particularly is a glitter red from Japan. It has so much more than just the Vita. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief explanation of what to look for if you want to hack a Vita, because you can't just hack any Vita. So I'm going to give a brief explanation of that, and this isn't going to be a full-fledged tutorial on how to hack your Vita. It's going to be more so showing what the Vita is capable of and then kind of comparing it to a hacked PSP, which is significantly easier to come across. And then at the end, I'll give a total overview of a hacked Vita. So let's go take a look at the Vita. So the first thing I want to note and that I want to talk about is how do you get all this storage on the Vita? And that is through this little Vita game to SD card adapter. Now to use this, you do need to make a config file that will boot the data from this instead of from the regular PS Vita storage memory card. And on this one, you can still use that for all your game saves and stuff like that. Alright, so the biggest thing to know and think about when trying to obtain a Vita to hack is it needs to be on firmware 3.6 or lower. And you can check that by going to settings, and then you'll go to system settings, and then it'll tell you what version you're on. And anytime you come across a Vita at any game store, you'd be like, hey, can I just test it out, check it out, and then you should see the firmware, and then if it's 3.6 or lower, get it, because those are the only ones that can be hacked. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at the actual Vita itself. So you have a standard Vita screen, all your regular normal all Vita stuff, but here we have some extras, and this is a folder called Emulators, which also has RetroArch. Now RetroArch is a multi-emulation program that can be used on multiple different platforms, and here it is on the Vita. So we have our Game Boy Advanced games, our Super Nintendo games, and then also our Sega Genesis games. So all of these emulation is all still there, but it's a little bit easier to set up on a PSP. So if this is your main goal for hacking a Vita, is to have all of the older stuff, you might be better off with just a regular good old PSP, because it does it just the same, and it's easier to set up, and it's easier to get a hold of and do, because pretty much every single PSP can be hacked, as opposed to with the Vitas, it has to be 3.6 firmware or lower. If it's above, it cannot be hacked. So here you see we have we got Streets of Rage 2, Sega Genesis game right here on our Vita. So that's great. But the Vita does a lot more than just the classic emulation. It also has something called Adrenaline, which is essentially a PSP. It's not, I don't even think it's an emulator. It's the PSP right here on your Vita. And I apologize for the weird stuff on the screen. That's because I'm filming the screen of the Vita, and certain angles mess it up with the camera. So here we have all of our PS1 games being run through the PSP, and then we also have PSP games. So that's how you'll access those. And a big thing to note that right here, so this, in a PSP game on a PSP, you move around with the analog stick, and then you look around with the D-pad for games, and then, but on a Vita, you have this right analog stick. Now, I greatly prefer to play my PSP games on a PS3 on a big screen television, but if you want to play PSP games with dual analog sticks, the Vita might be for you. And then you have all these additional settings inside of the PSP menu where you can actually change the graphics and how they look and smooth them out. You can also assign buttons to the touch screen, so that's how you'll play your PS1 games if they have multiple different buttons that the Vita doesn't have. And now right here, this is why you would want a hacked Vita. These are all the Vita games. This is every Vita game. And you can just go right here and just download them through Wi-Fi. And it's a massive list of all sorts of different, it's everything, every Vita game, and then I believe it's a lot of things that were on the Vita store, excluding games that need a higher firmware than 3.6 to run, which is a select few, which you can't play. Now, you have all these Vita games, and here's Odin Sphere, which I've been playing a lot of lately because it's awesome, and you just have it downloaded straight to your Vita and you can just play it. Now, the last thing that I didn't really mention was the brightness and the difference between the OLED screen and the LCD screen. So we're going to take a look at the different brightnesses because I got to experience the LCD screen and the OLED screen at the same time. I chose the OLED because it was glitter red. I mean, that's awesome, but I would have greatly actually preferred a LCD screen to the OLED. For the OLED screen, you kind of need to have the brightness at about 70% and no higher, but I actually keep it at all the way down all the time to preserve my screen for as long as possible. And like I said, I would have chosen the LCD, but I'm very, very happy with the glitter red. So when it comes to all your retro consoles, the Vita and the PSP, they both do all of it. When it comes to PS1, the Vita and the PSP, they both do all of it. So depending on what you're wanting, the PSP might be just as good of an option as a hacked Vita. So the biggest note was that the Vita was a little bit harder to set up the emulation for, and the emulators need a little bit more tweaking to get them just perfect, as opposed with the PSP, it's very smooth and just very easy out the box, very minimal setup or tweaking. So that's one thing to note. When it comes to playing the PSP games, the Vita is superior to the PSP. It's better to play your PSP games on a Vita. Now, in my personal opinion, it's significantly better to play your PSP games on a PS3 on a big screen. That's my personal opinion. So that's what I would say is if you wanna play PSP games on a big screen TV with a DualShock controller, just hack a PS3 to do that. Now for the Vita, where it really, really shines, no matter how good it does PSP games, that's just my preference to play them on a big screen. It does clean them up very well, but where the Vita really shines is just downloading Vita games from the Vita and having the full library to just download and play. Like, that's crazy. I had no idea how amazing the Vita library was until I had them all accessed at my fingertips, and then I really get to explore the console, and it's really, really sick. In my opinion, like, that was the cool part, and that was the part that I thought that I would use the least because I had no idea about the Vita library. And the final thing about the whole screens, because this is always a topic of conversation, OLED or LCD. Now, after only getting to play on an LCD and look at the LCD screen side by side with an OLED for relatively about an hour, the LCD is, in my opinion, it's not superior because the OLED is a better screen, but the LCD is significantly more practical. And I would rather have one for long-term use because you don't ever have to worry about burn-in, running it at low brightness. And the difference is it's very, very minimal. The LCD only looks so slightly less good to the point where you can only really tell if you're holding it right next to an OLED. And this was, if you remember when this came out, it was kind of when OLED technology was there, but it's not as common as today. And it's not as good as the screens that are in the cell phones that we have today because those are all practically OLED. So, I really hope you enjoyed seeing what the Vita was capable. Any questions whatsoever at all, leave them in the comments, and just remember, find a Vita 3.6 firmware or lower. 3.6 or 3.61 or above cannot be hacked. 3.6 or lower, snag it, grab it, just get it. Even if you don't want to hack it, just get it because somebody else will want it. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.